Hi, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on doing sociology. Today, I have with us Phil Zuckerman, who has written this very interesting book called Sociology Unplugged, a concise guide to contemporary sociology, which has been published by Routledge in 2026. So, I'm going to very briefly introduce Phil, who is a professor of sociology at Pitzer College and the author of several books apart from Sociology Unplugged, including What It Means to Be Moral, The Non-Religious, Living the Secular Life, Faith No More, and Society Without God, as well as the editor of several volumes, including the Oxford Handbook of Secularism and the Social Theory of W.E.B. Du Bois. Welcome, Phil, and thank you so much for zooming in early morning.
Yes, thank you for having me. My pleasure. Nice to see you.
Your book makes perfect sense to us since we are a platform of public sociology from the global south. So, I wanted to begin by asking you that you described this book as an anti-textbook. What were you resisting in conventional introductory sociology text?
Yeah, what I find is what I have found over the years is you have these big textbooks that are quite thick and heavy, and they're structured all the same. It's almost as if they read each other and just replicate each other, and it's just a sort of money-making scheme that the big publishers, I guess, go with. And they all kind of have the same format. It's very it's very formulaic. They all present theories in the same, oh, you have conflict theory and you have, symbolic interactionism and then you have functionalism and they just this is how they present everything. And then each chapter is divided into some topic. They always do the methods first, which I don't think is a good idea when you're introducing students to sociology. So, anyway, I think they're not terrible. I mean, sometimes they're a good resource. You can look up some of their citations and some of their references to sort of broaden your knowledge. But I think it's a horrible way to get students excited and interested in sociology, to sort of put this giant block on their lap and say, this is sociology. If that was my introduction to sociology, I would think it's very boring, very formulaic, a little bit simplistic sometimes. And so I wanted to write a book that was actually engaging and inviting and actually expressed my passion, like why sociology works for me, not this kind of like over the view, anonymous, detached voice. Like, okay, this is how so, and they always do the same thing where they like highlight the exact same terms and they bold them, and then there's a glossary in the back, and it's always the same terms from every textbook. So yeah, I just felt like um, doing something different that was more personal, more passionate. And if anything, I think my book could complement a textbook. If someone still wants to assign those big textbooks, I think my book would be a perfect would complement it because it would say, well, here's the kind of standard approach, but here's a more dynamic approach.
It's interesting you mentioned about making students excited about sociology because that is also our goal that we want younger generations to remain excited about sociology. And, there's nothing better than probably doing public sociology than that at this juncture of, what we are living through. I just wanted to ask you, how do you engage students who enter the classroom skeptical of sociology? Because you talk about making it, exciting. So what do you do?
I think stories really help, first of all. I actually learned that I teach at a college that's very interdisciplinary. And one of the fundamentals of our institution at Pitzer College in Claremont is we break up departments so that our offices are intermixed. At most universities and colleges, all sociology faculty would have their offices together, and all English literature would have their offices together, and all history. We don't do that. And I think, and the reason is we want to learn from each other. We don't want to just be in our own little box. And so I had a professor, Al Wachtel, next door to me who was an English professor. And I don't study literature, but we would have these great conversations. And one time he said to me, Phil, because I would sort of tease him, I'd say, oh, you just study stories, where's the data? Where's the empiricism? What? And he'd say, and one time he said to me, Phil, we're storytelling animals. That's how we evolved. And I noticed that if I started my classes with a story, it got students' attention. And then I could, after presenting the story, I could then relate it to theories, concepts, empirical findings. But the story stuck. So one way I try to do it is by using that approach, and I use that in my classroom, and I use it in my book. But I also think it's important for students to recognize, how much of their own identity is shaped by their surroundings, how much of their beliefs are shaped by their surroundings, their socio-historical context, their culture, their family. And that usually gets them to, even the most resistant student to sociology, once you start to say, like, well, let's talk about some of the things that you strongly believe in. Let's talk about some of the things that are the most significant aspects of your identity. And let's try to see in what ways are those inborn, or what ways would those be different had you been raised by different people in a different time, in a different culture. And that's how I get them to start thinking about it. And then the third thing I'll say is that I try to say to them, look, there's multiple sources of wisdom and insight. Sociology is one among many. So it's not that, I don't like the approach that, oh, everything is socially constructed and only sociology knows the truth of everything. No, that's not the case. There's a lot to be said about neurology and evolutionary psychology and biology and all the disciplines that shed light. And we're one voice at that table, and this is what we bring to the conversation, and that I find helps them, I guess, appreciate it.
Right. So, how do you balance accessibility with theoretical rigor while also avoiding, jargonizing?
Yeah, it's funny you should say that because I'm currently reading a book right now uh on I'm on a book committee to give an award. It's for the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. And so I'm reading this one book right now. I won't say what it's about or who wrote it, but it's very clear to me that this person is trying to say pretty basic, obvious things, but they don't want it to sound obvious and basic. So they're using all this strange jargon and all this weird verbiage and strange ways to sound more intelligent, more profound. And I sort of despise that approach. And I feel like, so getting to your question about theory, to me, really good, insightful theories ought to be crystal clear. And if they're too complex and if they're too difficult to grasp, they're not, in my opinion, very useful, and they're not very intelligent. In other words, what I mean by that is that even the most profound, in other words, I think, for example, Durkheim, I feel was a deeply profound thinker, and I felt like he saw things that most people didn't see, and we may not have even seen without his insights. Like how he theorized about society and all, it was just profound and amazing. It's pretty dense reading, but at the same time, if you can get the main thrust, it's pretty, I don't want to say simple, but it's clear. It's like, oh, this is what he's arguing. And it doesn't require in-depth years of study to get it. It doesn't require you don't have to have a master's degree. Like at the end of the day, I think what Durkheim is arguing can be articulated very succinctly, cogently, and clearly because it's brilliant. I mean, to me, that's the brilliance of great theory. To me, the greatest insight ever was Darwinian's understanding of evolution through human diversity and mutation. And it's brilliant, but at the end of the day, it's also quite simple. And so what I try to do is when I'm reading theory, and I love theory, I really always try to get to the core of it. What are its main points? And I feel like those are easy to present to people. I mean, it maybe takes some time, but if you can, Marx is very difficult to read. When I assign Marx, I struggle, and I've been reading it for 30 years. My students really struggle, but there are some really clear bullet point ideas that can be developed and uncovered and explained. So I always try to explain the heart and the root of theories of Gilman, Du Bois, Weber, Durkheim, Marx, whoever we're reading, Zimmel, and try to make them as crystal clear as possible because I think that's the point. We write to be understood. We talk to be understood. It's all about, so to me, simplifying, using a lot of stories as illustration, as examples, and then bringing in the empirical data to support or not support whatever the assertions being made. But that's the best way I try to do it.
I think that's a very interesting response and echoes very much with me because I also feel that the best kind of writing is which is very clear and doesn't hide behind, too much jargons, etc. So you talked
Exactly.
about Durkheim, and I want to ask you, do you think classical sociologists continue to remain relevant? And, if so, why?
Very much so. Maybe not every little aspect, maybe some of it is outdated. Maybe some of it is not as revolutionary as it was. I think, for example, when just off the top of my head, when Weber was writing about bureaucracy, it was very timely at the time to analyze bureaucracies as these new emerging forms of social organization was very cutting edge. I think now it's a little boring and outdated. I mean, it's still worth to read, but it's not like you're going to read that, oh, wow, this guy's really, got his finger on the pulse of the world. No. So obviously but that said, I think that the classical theorists still speak to us very much so. Whether it's Durkheim's, acknowledging the power of society and how I use Durkheim, for example, in understanding Christian nationalism in the United States right now. People are always asking me, how can these Christians be so, pro-Trump? I mean, how can these Christians be so, for things that are so against the teachings of Christ? And I say, well, read Durkheim, where he talks about, it's society worshiping itself. It's the tribe worshiping itself. You have these white Christians in America who are sort of worshiping their own identity and their own what they see as a threatened status. And so all these things become symbols. So Jesus and Trump and Christ, they all become symbols, but they don't represent the teachings of Jesus. They represent white America, and I feel like that's the exact kind of insight that Durkheim provided for us. Marx, again, I don't agree with everything, all his productions, maybe not, but I don't understand how you can make sense of most conflicts in the world today without taking a materialistic approach. I mean, look what's happening right now with in Iran and the Straits of Hormuz. And I mean, everybody's talking about, oil and who's going to control the means of production. And this is causing conflict. I mean, if you want to throw Marx out, good luck trying to explain a lot of conflicts in the world. With Du Bois, I think his insights about race are just as relevant as they are today, maybe even more so. So yeah, to me, I feel like it's very important to recognize that, and I mentioned Weber earlier. I mean, whatever you think of the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, whether you agree or disagree, still the idea that there can be unintended consequences in history, that ideas have a way to shape our world, whether we intend to or not. All of these things I think are still very, very profound and important. So yes, to me, they're alive and well. Not all of them and not everything, but much of them. Yeah.
Right, right. So, we also love to talk about the sociological imagination in the Indian context. C.W. Mills is one of the classical texts that is taught. So, what does sociological mindfulness or imagination offer students, and not just intellectually, but perhaps emotionally?
Yeah, that's a tough one and that's a good one. When I used to teach intro to sociology, I haven't taught it in a while, but I do it every few years. But I used to teach it every year. And I remember I always would notice that like the first couple weeks, I would always try and convey the sociological imagination, sociological mindfulness, and a lot of that was, looking at the ways in which we're shaped by socio-historical circumstances, looking at the ways in which our life story only makes sense in a socio-historical context, but really getting even deeper, looking at the ways in which our deeply held values have been shaped in many ways by those around us. And what I would find is that the first few weeks, students would get very interested and excited, and then there would almost be this like depressed moment where they'd be like, "Well, why am I even in college? Am I just in college because I was socialized to think I have to do this?" Am I only in college because of, the social circumstances of our American society say that I must? And, I start to think like, well, who am I and why am I doing what I'm doing? And I think that's an important journey, because it's better to be, I think, aware than not. It's better to be cognizant of the forces that shape our lives than not. I always tend, it may not make us happier people. I think there's some truth that ignorance is bliss, but I prefer to live in a world with my eyes wide open. I think a sober view of the world is better than a non-sober view in terms of living existentially, professionally, personally, in relationships. So I feel like getting students to see the degree to which social forces are important, the degree to which we are shaped by them, the degree by which much of our world is socially constructed and what that means. I think at the end of the day is it's an existential journey and a personal journey, and it helps us better understand why we do what we do, what commitments we want to uphold and which ones we don't, why we feel the way we feel about certain things. I mean, it does get to the sociology of emotion, even when you're talking about things like, jealousy. I mean, in Ingalls, Origins of the Private Property in the State, he argues that even sort of jealousy in a monogamous relationship is a social construct. And that's hard for me to swallow. Like, really? Jealousy? And we talk about polyamory and we talk about monogamy and we talk about, is it natural to feel jealous or is it really something we internalize as a social construct? And I can go either way on that, by the way. But so those kinds of things I think help students understand themselves better. And sometimes it's a little bit unsettling, but that's education.
I have a follow-up kind of a question that we are also living in a time when there's a lot of misinformation and, of course, algorithmic echo chambers. So, can the sociology as a discipline, do anything to contribute towards this democratic discourse?
Yeah, I'm struggling with that right now. Our realities are becoming more and more different as we expose ourselves to different social media, different news outlets. My reality is so different from my mother-in-law's, for example. It's almost like we're living in a different world based on what she sees on her screen and what I see on my screen. I would like to think that sociology has always emphasized digging beneath the surface, looking beyond the smoke screens of reality, to quote Peter Berger. Sociology has always had that debunking spirit of not accepting official versions of reality. However, what are the official versions of reality anymore? It was easier to debunk the media when you had three major networks and they ran the TV and everybody watched these, NBC in the United States, it was NBC, ABC, and CBS. Those were the three sources of television news and everybody watched the same news and you could really dig deep. Now, no one even is watching those. Everybody's watching these 3-minute things on TikTok and who knows who makes them. So I would like to think that sociology, the tools of sociology, being empirical, questioning, following the money, not accepting things at face value. I think those things are more relevant than ever. How successful we will be, I don't know. I am a little bit pessimistic, especially with AI. What I noticed is now when you show someone a video of something that they don't agree with, whether it's Trump making some statement or somebody getting killed in the Middle East, or, even a video, people will say, that's probably just AI. In other words, our eyes, so I think it is getting harder and harder um to fight and resist. But if sociology isn't going to help us, I don't know what is. I mean, so it's an uphill battle, but to me, the values, principles, and sort of main goals of sociology are still more relevant and applicable than ever. And hopefully we can develop even better tools to help our students and ourselves understand truth, get at truth, fight for truth, and try to uncover it.
In one of your chapters, you frame sociology as subversion and liberation, and you talk about role of sociology in that. So, could you talk a little bit about that? What do you mean by that? Also, I mean, can sociology ever truly be neutral?
Oh man. Okay, well, I'll do the subversion and the liberation, and then we'll get to the neutral at the end. How about that? For me, I was just trying to get students to see that there's a sort of subversive aspect to sociology. And what I mean by that is, Peter Berger had this quote in the 1960s where he said, people who prefer to think that, you know, the world is just like Sunday school, um, should avoid sociology, meaning, it's our job or has always been our job to sort of take a step back. Why are things the way they are? How are power relations playing out here? Who really has the power? Are there people behind, is the mayor really the most powerful person in your town, or is it the person that owns the factory and tells the mayor what to do? So in sociology, we're by constantly looking at sort of the roles that we have to play and how those work, by looking at power dynamics, even by just looking at how things are socially constructed over time. All of that, I think, is a bit subversive to the sort of official versions of reality, right? I think I've used that term, and I think I get that from Berger as well. So part of sociology is, subvert. I mean, in other words, it's hard to be religious in a traditional sense if you take sociological wisdom to its full conclusion. So, for example, if you are a particular religion, sociology will ask you to say, well, are you only that religion because your parents are? Are you only that religion because your community is? Are you only that religion because your nation is? And how does your location in that family, in that culture, in that society, uh, how did that put its religious stamp on you? And then it forces you to say, well, and in what ways was your religion socially constructed? Did humans create this religion over time? And you have to look into that. So, yes, of course, you can still be religious and be a sociologist, but there is something about the sociological perspective that can be subverting to a traditional religious worldview. And I think it's no accident that all the founders of sociology lost their faith. Durkheim, Du Bois, Gilman, Weber called himself religiously unmusical. Thorsten Veblen. I mean, it's hard to maintain. Now, that may just be a coincidence. Marx, obviously. Okay, so there's something subverting about to the dominant views of the world when you take sociology seriously. But at the same time, that viewpoint, and we touched upon it a little bit earlier, can also be liberating. And I like the metaphor that Berger uses of the puppet theater. And he's like, look, part of sociology is seeing this, it's like we're almost like puppets on a stage, and there are these strings that have been controlling us or do control us. And those strings are social forces, family influence, societal influence, the media, all these things that are shaping us and directing our lives. And he said, however, we can go through life as puppets and never stop and think about, well, why do I want to get married at this time? Why do I want to marry that particular person? Why am I pursuing this career? Why do I have these goals and values? Are they my own, or did they come from outside and impose themselves on me? It's better at least to look up and recognize, oh, there are strings there. That act that I'm doing is being driven by some other force outside of my own will or my own choice. And so I think ultimately sociology is a very liberating sociological wisdom is very liberating. It helps us live more freely, more aware. We're no longer living so much in bad faith. There's an existential liberation, I think, that comes from the insights that sociology can provide. Now, you asked if sociology can ever be neutral. Is that correct? So my answer to that would be yes and no. It depends what we're asking, and it depends what we're trying to assert. So when we're doing sociological research, for example, there's probably two reasons we're doing it. Reason number one is someone is paying us to do it, in which case, that's, not necessarily a neutral endeavor. Or reason number two is we're interested in it. We think it's important. So maybe we're not getting paid, but we're interested in what's going on in the food industry, or we're interested in gender dynamics, or we're interested, in politics or nationalism or whatever it is. So in that sense, what we choose to study is either being paid for or is out of personal passion. So right away, there's some subjective choice at play. So it's not completely neutral. It's not like we just pick a topic out of a hat. We put 1,000 social topics in a hat, and oh, I guess I'm going to study gardening. No, it doesn't work that way. That said, once we find something of interest, there are obviously ways in which we can pursue our sociology in a more or less biased way. There are mechanisms we can employ to check our own biases. There are techniques we can use in our research to limit our own biases. There are ways we can strive to be more fair, more unbiased, more neutral in our research. So I think it can be neutral depending on the methods we employ, how we frame our conclusions, how we seek to falsify our own theories. So in that sense, it's a sliding scale. I don't think anything is purely neutral or purely unneutral, but I think some of us are a bit more biased in our work and we just let it fly, and others of us try harder to keep our biases in check by employing the most neutral methods we can. But we do the best we can. And at least, the thing about sociology is it's a group endeavor. So I may put out some assertions, and if someone thinks I'm wrong, or if someone thinks, they can refute what I've argued with better data and better theory and better thinking. So in that sense, to me, I feel like the enterprise itself is pretty good. But we all bring our personal biases, conscious or unconscious, into the work we do, for sure. How could it couldn't be any other way.
Thank you so much for those responses. I think this has been a very, very enjoyable conversation. And I really hope that, our audience picks up your book and takes to reading it. And thank you once again for doing this early in the morning. It was a very, very, enjoyable discussion. Thank you.
My pleasure. I'm grateful you had me. Take care. Thank you so much.